Sydney Settlers' First Contact by Kevin Zhu and Angus Craw. Why did the first settlers settle in Sydney? In 1770, the ship HMS Endeavour, under the command of James Cook, sailed along the east coast of Australia. On April of the same year, they landed at a bay in the current southern Sydney. The ship's naturalist, Sir Joseph Banks, was very impressed with the amount of plants and animals unknown to British science, so he named the area Botany Bay. The British decided to settle in Australia because they needed room for the convicts, but it wasn't the first place they wanted to settle at around the world. All the other countries turned them away because they didn't want to have to deal with the convicts. They chose Australia because of a law called terra nullius, meaning unoccupied land, so they said it was theirs for the taking. In 1788, the first fleet containing 11 vessels under Captain Arthur's command arrived. There were over 700 convicts and nearly 700 sailors and soldiers, with 50 women and children. What major events happened after the settlers settled at Sydney? The homeland of the Aboriginals suddenly evicted them out. The first problem was the diseases. Because the diseases were brought from Britain, the Aboriginals had never encountered them before, hence their body wasn't adjusted to handle them. The diseases included measles and smallpox. Not only did the Aboriginals die, but the British as well. The British reacted in different ways to the Aboriginals. Some were treated with kindness, while others were just attacked and discriminated against. The Aboriginal also did the same thing. Some of them welcomed the newcomers, while others reacted with violence, often ambushing the convicts sent to work in the bush. Some of the Aboriginal people were caught by the British and were taught English to act as translators between both races. Philip wanted the Aboriginals to learn the British ways, so he showed kindness towards them, but the Aboriginal people tried to avoid the British. The Aboriginal people became hostile after they realized that their land and resources were being taken away from them. The Aboriginals started to attack the British. The Aboriginals were no match for the British weapons, so slowly they had to rely on the British for resources because their land was being taken. The Aboriginals and British started off with a rather mutual relationship, with trading of food, water, and other necessities of daily life. Not all the British were from Ireland. Some were quite peaceful, so some Aboriginals adapted to the British lifestyle, while some moved far away from the slow-starting town from servants. How did these events change the lives of the Aboriginals? British settlement had a devastating effect on the Aboriginal people. Their loss of land, exposure to new diseases, and fighting the British resulted in the loss of the majority of the Aboriginal population. The Aboriginals that didn't die during the first few years after the British arrival were still affected. The British changed their lives and the future generation as well. There were around 750,000 Aboriginal living in Australia at the time of James Cook's arrival. Because they lived alone, they had to develop their own way of life, and most of their work and culture were lost right after the British arrived. When the settlers arrived in Australia, they brought with them many British diseases. These diseases included chickenpox, smallpox, typhoid, measles, and influenza. The Aboriginal people had absolutely no immunity to these new diseases. This was partly the reason why most of the Aboriginal population died out, along with the many massacres that had also occurred. The Battle of Pinjarra in Western Australia, Myall Creek Massacre in New South Wales, and the Warringal Creek Massacre in Victoria are the three infamous massacres in Australian history. Sometimes the Aboriginal people managed to scatter the settlers, which resulted in them abandoning their farms. The settlers just found new ways to stop this. Instead of going out and fighting them, they would just poison most of their resources, like food and water. This was a fairly cruel method to stop the Aboriginals, as they had no idea what was going on. All the British people were enthusiastic about meeting the Aboriginals. Some were treated like animals just because they had the slightest differences from the British, like they didn't wear much clothes, while other times they were approached by friendly and kind people. Sometime around the 1800s, the British government stopped trying to get the Aboriginals to merge with the British, but it turned into keeping them out instead. The soldiers were ordered to kill the Aboriginals that were disturbing the farmers because they were either stealing the livestock or harassing the settlers in general. The British also tried to assimilate Aboriginal culture. They did this by destroying things the Aboriginals had made, like ancient Aboriginal art, and by arresting anyone that took part in the Aboriginal customs. The Aboriginals that didn't join the British Society had to fight for their lives and their culture. Many years after this, the Aboriginals are still being treated like rubbish. This caused a lot of dispute, as the Aboriginals wanted human rights and to be treated like normal human beings. By the 1930s, the policy of assimilation was fully taking place. The policy of assimilation led to many Aboriginal children being taken away from their families and being put into foster care or group homes. These children have been now become known as the stolen generation.